So, Michael, we've got a war happening on the doorsteps of Europe. We've got China resurgent, making quite bellicose noises about Taiwan. Is this the biggest threat level we've faced since the Cold War?
Yes, I think we've been facing it actually for quite a long time. You just haven't been prepared to recognise it. But, you could go back to 2010 comfortably and see the direction of travel of Russia. China, perhaps not at that time. It's taken a bit longer for it to get round. But I've been disappointed to see the expansionist approach of China. I rather thought she would want to consolidate and be a great economic power, which she is. But the move into the military field worries me. So yes, you're right. This is a bad time.
Yeah, it's all changed with President Xi. Absolutely. Yes. And you're right. You could see, couldn't you, as we went through the 2010s, with things in Georgia, the Crimea, this threat was there. And yet, here's the extraordinary thing. We've been committed to wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya. I mean, arguably, we've been busier, our service has been busier in the last 20 years than they were in the previous half a century. And yet, the national debate, and particularly at general elections, when it comes round to defence seems to have moved down to the bottom of the pile.
I think that's probably right. I mean, a lot of people try hard to bring it up, and there's some very good commentators, both on the radio, television, and in the press, to do it. It doesn't seem to catch the imagination, shall we say, of the politicians who've got the obvious issues of, getting re-elected, and what's going to re-elect them? It's probably not defence.
Yeah, but then it's like chicken and egg here, isn't there? Because the more leaders talk about an issue, the more the public would understand the issue, and the more perhaps the media would cover it. I mean, obviously spending is always a very, very big issue. I mean, at the time that you were, Chief of the Air Staff, and we're going back almost exactly 30 years, we were spending a lot more money on our military then than we are today. We've been spending under 2% of our GDP for most of the last few years. Apparently, we're now at 2.2%, but some say we've included lots of ceremonial duties in that. Are we spending too little money on defence?
Yes. And I think a lot of people have begun to recognise it. I mean, a number of politicians have said we should be spending 3%. Given the circumstances, it's hard to say. How can you possibly, when you carry out reviews, when things around, you've discussed Georgia, you've just Crimea, yep, and all the rest of it. How is it that you can continue to address that problem, which is a problem, let's face it, to our security, to our freedom, and just continue to spend 2%? And this GDP thing is a little bit of a misnomer, because it goes up and down. So, if you're in any sort of business, but particularly in procurement, if you're spending a percentage of something and it's going down, you're not actually going to be able to pay for what you want. So all of these things play.
Yeah, I mean, the 2%, of course, really came from NATO, didn't it? This was the agreement of NATO members that people would spend 2%, and of course the Americans have spent considerably more than 2% over the last few years.
Yes.
Most of the rest of Europe has spent considerably less than 2%.
Exactly.
But there is a trend now, isn't there, in Germany and elsewhere, to start spending a bit more on defence?
Yes, I mean, it's taken the invasion of Ukraine to actually get people to wake up to what's been confronting them for 10, 12, 13 years.
On the other side of things, the geopolitics of it, I've been one of the very few people who's been critical of the continued eastward expansion of the EU and indeed of NATO. And by the way, I fully understand why the Poles wanted to join NATO. I fully understand why the Estonians wanted. If I'd been Estonian or Polish, I would have wanted to join NATO. But I'd always felt that the ever eastwards encroachment would be used by Putin as a political weapon with his own people. Now we're talking about Ukraine potentially being fast-tracked as a member of NATO, and it would seem that political voices everywhere are saying that somehow this might be a good idea. What is your view?
It's a very difficult one. I mean, I go back to my time in the mid-90s, when I think we missed a chance to make Russia more user-friendly. As a result of that, we got Putin. And Putin probably came in with a view, because he was KGB and very unhappy with what had happened before. But I just wonder if we'd been a little bit more accommodating to Russia, brought her into other arrangements, and as a good person, whether we would be facing what we are today. I don't know, but I think we missed an opportunity.
And that expansion, that ambition to expand, goes back to the 90s, doesn't it? It was by that period of the mid-1990s we were talking about that further eastward expansion.
Yes, I'm not sure it got the attention in the way that we're talking about it then that it should have done. I sort of go back to my colleagues. I don't think that we necessarily were rushing to enlarge NATO at the time. We were dealing with the aftermath of the Cold War, basically dismantling the armed forces as quickly as they could to get the peace dividend.
The peace dividend, yes, the peace dividend. Yeah, I'm sure you very well remember that. You had to deal with that. If Ukraine does join NATO, and Putin is still, he may not be, but if he's still the leader of Russia, is that going to provoke a reaction?
I think, I was reading an article, I think it was by Edward Lucas just yesterday, who suggested that we've got to find some middle way here. And we've got to get him out of Ukraine, but at the same time, we've got to find a way in which we don't totally humiliate big Russia, Mother Russia. That's going to be very difficult. Is it possible that we could find a way? I mean, if you look at Korea, as the article said, we've actually never stopped that war in theory. And we've got UN and people there.
Peacekeepers, yeah.
Peacekeepers, sort of. Is there a possibility that we could develop something like that? And I think we've got to find something. I don't think it's all or nothing.
When President Zelensky speaks, he seems to be speaking on behalf of all of us. And he says that retaking Crimea is one of his top priorities. But he insists all the time there should be no negotiations. Why does nobody talk about peace? Is it too early?
Probably. I mean, I think at the moment we have to see how that offensive goes and all the rest of it. It's always better to be talking about peace when you're winning than when you're losing. I'm not saying they're losing, but at the moment it's uncertain which way it's going, isn't it?
It is, and as I say, he seems to speak on behalf of NATO. NATO has been, to a greater or lesser degree, quite unified. But interesting, isn't it, that Ben Wallace, somebody who clearly really does enjoy the role that he's got as our defence secretary. You can tell his heart and soul is in it, and we're coming up for a new boss of NATO later this year, and the Americans have effectively vetoed the appointment of Ben Wallace. And I'm wondering about this. I thought, well, of course it's, I would say this obviously, but it's because Biden doesn't like the Brits. But is it that maybe they're not taking us seriously anymore?
I think it was 8 years ago, something like that. Stanley McChrystal, you remember him?
Yep.
Very, very bright general, American general. Said something when the size of the British Army was on its way down, and the other armed services as well. He said something like, you reach a point when you just don't get consulted anymore on the big decisions. And he was an admirer of the Brits. But what he was saying was, when your armed forces are down at that level, why should you be consulted? Because what are you actually bringing to the table?
So could that be why Ben Wallace?
I think it's a feature of it. I do. I mean, it's the total reason. But I think, and a difficult one for you, but coming out of the EU and our presence in the EU has lost, America dials Europe. Who does she speak to? She used to speak to us. She doesn't any longer because we're not in Europe.
So who does she speak to?
Real good question, don't know.
I don't think she bothers, but maybe I'm wrong on that point. I mean, one of the things that I felt about EU membership was this rapid movement towards the European Union having its own military assets. And I thought, well, you can't run that in parallel with NATO.
Well, I agree. And I think it was total unification in UK on that issue. I don't think, whichever side of the fence you're on, that seemed to be just duplication. And our allies in Europe love lots of headquarters and to look posh and all the rest of it. And we'd had enough of that. All this would have been another headquarters, and they wouldn't have added one soldier or one aeroplane to the deal. It would just complicated things.
Yeah. We talk about our size, our relevance, whether McChrystal was right all those years ago. whether it's part of the reason why Wallace is not going to get the top NATO job. But it's interesting, when we get national debate around the size of our armed forces, it's nearly always the army that gets talked about. That's what the tabloid press talk about. You know, the army's going down to 73,000 men. It's the smallest army we've had since Queen Anne was on the throne. And we don't talk quite enough about the Royal Air Force and what's happening to that. So, Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Graydon, is the RAF now too small?
Yes. I mean, you can't look at what has happened over the last 13 years and be steadily whittling down the numbers, the mass of the service, and not reach a point when actually it's too low. And I'm just reading today the very good lecture given by the head of the army, Patrick Saunders,
Yep.
Who said mass is important. And people like me and others in the Royal Navy and the Army have been talking about mass. It's very easy to say, no, you don't need mass. Technology has taken over from it. I say, no, sorry. Just look at history. You need mass. I mean, what's going on in Ukraine at the moment? Technology is playing a part, but it's mass.
But it's mass. Yeah, it's air superiority, it's boots on the ground.
Exactly. And if you haven't got it, you're at risk.
So we are, the figures I see, we only have about 128 operational fighter jets in the country, which is about a third the size of when you were.
I think we need to nail this as one. We have 6 combat-capable Typhoon squadrons. That's 72.
72?
At 72 frontline. Now, we have a few in the conversion units and the rest. And then we've got a squadron of the Lightning, 20-odd aeroplanes, mostly tied up, of course, with the carrier and all of that. No doubt we'll talk about that in a moment. Those Typhoon squadrons are currently in the Falklands, on guard, in UK, on guard, in the Balkans, on guard, and by the way, they're still in Iraq and Syria on operations on a daily basis. That is a hell of a task. That is operational tempo of magnitude. And I don't see why we can't get the message across to our politicians that this is simply not enough to carry out this range of tasks. And we're not in a fighting battle with, other than the one in Iraq and Syria, and that's for debate. If you started losing aeroplanes and pilots, you've got nothing to replace them. That's worrying.
Which brings me on to pilots. Pilots, we're told, firstly, there's a recruitment process, which has gone, I think woke is the word, that it's the RAF want to choose pilots on the basis of diversity as opposed to ability. Is that right? Is that really happening?
Well, there was a big chat about it, wasn't there, on thing. I don't know precisely what was said or what was implied and where there were sort of misunderstandings and all of that. But I think I'm absolutely clear, and I think the Air Force has perhaps subsequently been absolutely clear that it must be on merit. I mean, this problem of getting diversity, getting both female and the minorities into the armed services has been with us ever since I can remember. I mean, once upon a time in the National Service, they were all over the place. Not so much the women, obviously, but the men.
Yep.
And it all worked perfectly well, in my view. We moved on, we're much smaller, and so on. But there are parts of the community. I'll give you an example. You want very clever cyber and space-orientated people, and the Indian community in this country seems to be very, very good at that sort of thing. So it's definitely in your interest to try and recruit these people. But, and I remember this from my day, they actually don't want to join the military because they want to go make money. And they can, because they're very clever, and they set up their own businesses and so on and so on. And very often they get into the IT world and so on and so on. So yes, it's a good thing to have some diversity in there, but to try to mirror it to the population and, as it were, adjust, manipulate, if you like, the figures to get it, that is quite wrong. And we have to continue to go in the military for the best people, regardless.
And pilots leaving the Royal Air Force. It's said that there are more qualified pilots than there are planes, and people who've trained hard and want to do this job leaving, taking better jobs in commercial aviation. It sounds like there's a big morale problem in the RAF.
Well, I talked about operational tempo. And if you've got people away from home, the amount they are, I think the same in the helicopter force as it is in the Typhoon force. I don't think it's just confined to the Royal Air Force either. I think the Royal Navy face it. They're away from home an awful lot as well. And yes, add into it the problems that have been with infrastructure on the stations, the married quarters, which you'll have seen the stories about the married quarters and whatever. I mean, if you've got your partner, wife or whatever at home and the water's dripping down the walls, they're not going to be very happy when you come back having been away for 6 months or whatever.
The whole thing's in decline, isn't it?
Well, it is. And unfortunately, when you go round stations today, and I do, they look tired. They look very tired. And I think that all adds to, the guys and the girls give great service, and, they'll spend a certain time in the service. But after they've had 10 or 12 years of that, they're probably saying, I don't think I want to stay much longer. We've got to get back to a time when they want to make a career in the service, and there are various ways that can be done. But it will take people to really confront the problem.
So it isn't just money.
It isn't just money. No.
There is a cultural issue here as well about the way we treat members of our armed forces. You mentioned accommodation. These things are very, very important. You mentioned kit, and that's obviously very, very important. But somehow, whenever I go to America, I travel around America a lot, and the announcement for the aeroplane comes, and it's first-class passengers and current serving members of the military. And they're made to feel that they're all 7 feet tall.
It is special, you're quite right. Yeah.
We don't do that, do we?
No, we don't. I do think that a large percentage of the population does recognise the armed forces as special. It would be nice. I'll give you an example of, in a little way, what some of us are trying to do. We talked about the dam busters at the International Bomb Command Centre. We've had 12,000 children through that wonderful place near Lincoln. And I was up there yesterday and watching the kids there. They were doing things, being talked to generally about Bomber Command and things like that, but really just out there enjoying themselves and being children and all of that. And just picking up the vibes of something that's really alive. I think that plays eventually to, gosh, didn't I enjoy that? That was the military.
Yes. Well, or coming to this magnificent RAF museum here at Hendon, and it's much the same thing. Prioritisation is always difficult. We touched on the carriers earlier, the sheer number of aeroplanes we've put on the carriers. Are the carriers vital for the UK's security or a giant vanity project?
Well, one of the things that I thought we would talk about was global Britain. Mm-hmm. I think this is frankly a great delusion. If you want to be a great power, or if you want to be global Britain and be able to reach into the things, you've got to have certain things. And I was reminding myself of the words, and I'll have to paraphrase them, can't remember totally, but Max Hastings writing, I think he was giving a lecture somewhere, and Max got good turn of words, and basically what he said, something along the lines of an ally is only as good as the power that it can bring in support of an ally, and this means military power as well. And I think that's right. Why has America why have we had the so-called special relationship? It's not down to our economy, it's not down to our diplomats play a part in it, but the bottom line has always been that we were pretty good at the military bit. We worked alongside very successfully with the Americans. They liked it, we spoke the same language, more or less. That was it. That was what it was all about. Research and intelligence and things like that. That's what it's about. And don't pretend that just by saying global Britain that we're up in that league.
If we're not a fully respected member of NATO in the way we used to be, then global Britain is a fantasy, and I understand that. Let's turn the clock back 30 years. Let's put Graydon back in charge of the whole shooting match. What would you be saying loudly? What would your absolute first 2 or 3 priorities be for the Royal Air Force?
Well, I'm absolutely sure that the new head of the Air Force, who's just literally taken over, will be putting the people first. If there are morale concerns, we've got to address those. They're absolutely vital, because without the people, nothing happens. And I look forward to seeing what he'll do in that field. It is always people, you know, in my time I had to go through a wretched time of getting rid of, when I took over the Air Force we had about 89,000 people. When I left we had 57,500 people. That was tough. That was tough. But what we did get from that, and as I say, it was not an enjoyable period, we did get a damn good equipment program. You know, a lot of the things that we've got today came from that sacrifice, if you like, and that needed explaining to people. And I and my team would go out and share from the, you know, right down with the troops, right the way through the sergeant's mess and the officer's mess and all the rest of it, and explain. And, you know, it was tough. And, you know, people were pretty unhappy about it. But nevertheless, if you share those things, you share what you're trying to do with people, I believe they respond.
But we have to turn this around and stop decline.
We have to. We have to. We really have, because for the reasons that you've touched on, it's been in decline for a long time.
Thank you, Sir Michael, for being so frank.
Pleasure.